Hey everybody, this is Jeff Romo. It's your Uncle Jeff with InnRoads Ministries, and we're coming together tonight to chat a little bit about role-playing games. It's a new segment I'd like to call RPG Jam Sessions, and it's about getting together with the folks in the Tavern or the fans out there from InnRoads Ministries and talk about their gaming experience. For tonight, I have Brian, who's going to be joining me in. It's his first time as a dedicated game master, and I thought this would be a fantastic opportunity to have kind of a question and answer scenario over the course of the campaign. So what we'll do is we'll have little short segments, 15-20 minute segments, where we'll go through a few questions, have a little chat back and forth, and then find out how he's enjoying his first foray into game mastering. But
Yeah,
I'll say this, Brian. I'll let you go ahead and give me the pedigree list because if you guys haven't seen him, he's been on a couple of our shows before. But let's tell the audience a little bit about where you come from as far as gaming is concerned.
absolutely. So I've been board gaming for maybe 5 or 6 years. I love a good Euro game. Don't get to pull out the big heavies very much anymore. So I'll play a little bit of everything, but I've only been role playing now for maybe 3 or 4 months since I started playing some games in the tavern with people. I actually about a year ago I picked up the beginners game for the Star Wars Age of Rebellion, and we fudged our way through that thing, and we kind of got the mechanics down, and we played it like it was a board game. Comes with a gorgeous map and tokens, and we ended up. It was much more of a set. It was almost like we ran a Imperial Assault campaign with tokens instead of minis. And so it wasn't really until I got into it about 3 or 4 months ago that I was like, oh, okay, this is,
Yeah.
I'm starting to get it now. So that's sort of where I'm at in in my role playing, and just getting my toes in, and I'm loving it. And yeah.
So you said you're talking like 3 or 4 months that you've actually played role playing games, that you transitioned from board games to playing role playing games. Is that did I hear that
Yeah,
right?
I mean that our D&D session over the summer one shots was the first time I'd say I really did a role playing game.
Wow.
We,
Well,
we kind of we
I'm
kind of
super
played
honored.
around.
I'm super honored, man. That's pretty
Well,
cool.
that was great. Yeah.
So, well, okay. So I'm trying to think of like all the different games that I would walk somebody through as a kind of like a first time role playing experience. One of the things that I learned many years down the road of gaming was I'd like to try and go simple first. That's
Hmm.
kind of what I would like to choose. But at the same time, I want to make sure that there's an experience with the rules, right?
Yeah.
I think D&D kind of hits that sweet spot really well. If I wanted to go with somebody that I know is really fascinated with storytelling and narrative, that sort of thing, I would probably go with something like a Dungeon World, something that's based on the Apocalypse World engine, just because you have some rules. You need a box in which to travel and do your thing, but so why Star Wars? Why the Fantasy Flight game system?
Well, it was what probably drew it to me first was I'd read an article, it was about a year ago. I don't remember which site, but it was one of those 5 reasons you should be role playing or whatever. And I read it and I was like, okay, I could get into this. And and they were talking about D&D and some of these other Pathfinder and other games, and they one of the ones they talked about was Edge of Empire. And they mentioned, hey, there's a beginner's game that you can buy, and I was like, oh, okay, that kind of got me intrigued. And it was, for me, Star Wars, it was the fact that you could get a cheap beginner's game in a box that sort of walked you through. And by the way that those beginners game works is that it interleaves the rules within the narrative structure. And so for somebody being completely brand new to role playing games and essentially being the pseudo GM of that game with my family when we were playing it did help me sort of work our way through those rules.
Nice.
And so in that sense, it's a pretty fantastic beginner box. As I've looked at other systems and played in a few now. And so that, that sort of drew me in. It was, getting my nephew and my brother-in-law to play a Star Wars game was easy, so I knew I could convince people because of the universe that it was set in that was familiar. So I think that's what drew me in. It was nice, easy entry point matched with something that everybody's familiar with.
Right.
Those two things. In retrospect, if I was giving somebody advice, I don't know if that's what I would suggest. I probably would say, if you really want to play role-playing games, find somebody and play a game of D&D with them, or like you said, Dungeon World would be good. But we're out there on our own with nobody to show us what to do. So, and that's I think we kind of stumbled in the right spot. So,
right. And the cool thing about it too is that if you found willing people, your family, which is actually kind of cool, because then there's the groundwork laid there that we play games together, and this can be something we can share around the table versus sitting in front of the TV.
Yeah.
I like the idea of going with a property that if you're not in the hobby, if you're not in the RPG hobby, going with something that's tried and true like Star Wars kind of helps you. It gets you over the need to have a bunch of books, right?
Mm-hmm.
With Star Wars, it's like, okay, I know the trilogy, I know the prequels, and I know the new movies that are coming out, so I have an idea of where we're at and what we're doing. I know what a blaster is, I know what a starship is, that sort of thing. So you go with something that it makes it easier to kind of bring in those rules. And did you find that to be the case? I mean, it sounded like it, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's this interesting dynamic of some of I'm finding now in trying to set up my first campaign for my players to go through. When I was, I'd done some thinking before about, I'm starting to think I'd like to run a game, mostly because I want to play more. And if I run the game, then hopefully I can set the times that I play, which, is a little bit easier. So there was that element of like, I'd like to run something, because I love the world building and thinking big. And I'm finding this interesting catch-22 of Star Wars being simple and everyone understands the universe. But then in some ways that's restrictive, because, you have sort of canon to deal with, and and you're playing with people going, I think these people probably know the names of the ships and the droids and the weapons better than I, and like, so there's this interesting dynamic of like, it's interesting, but it's also, it can be restrictive. I'm trying, I'm still sort of feeling my way through that in these first few sessions. But I will say, in terms of GMing my first game, the fact that the interactions, and particularly the combat sort of scenarios of it's mostly blasters. It's familiar. So like not having to deal with like 50 pages of spells in like a game like D&D, you know what I mean? So in terms of what they might pull in a combat situation, and having to adjudicate that's super simple. And in the Star Wars game with these sort of narrative dice, like I'm finding that's really easy to work our way through rolls. Like it's almost more like I'm presenting them with things, and in terms of like what's happening, we're kind of co-narrating those dice rolls. And so as a new GM, like I don't have to be like as much of a rules lawyer to, know everything perfect.
You can turn it over to them and say, okay, well, you got this triumph. And for those who haven't, seen the Star Wars dice, what they look like, I mean, you'll see some dice down in the bottom right-hand corner. They're just the regular menagerie that you would get with a role-playing game. But with Star Wars, they've gone the step further and created scenarios based on what you see face up, whether it's a triumph or a success or a despair. A lot of these things are not so much that you did or you get the thing that you want, it's how did it happen. Maybe you're trying to fly a ship out of a starbase, but you get a despair in there, so maybe you break your hyperdrive when you're doing it. But you talk about that, right? And I think that's actually, to your point, I think it's actually kind of cool to involve them in that narrative result. right? The dice enhance the narrative. You're telling a story. They're trying to steal something, or they're trying to capture an imperial officer or something like that. And we're going to move that narrative forward, but something's going to happen, and that's what happens in the movies, right? They try to make the jump to light speed, and then all of a sudden the Millennium Falcon makes that wah 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 wah, and it's like, okay, they're not going to make it, but maybe he rolled a despair there, but they got a success, so they didn't get captured, whatever the case is. So I think that with games, especially with new players and with new GMs such as yourself, it's really important to look for those things that create touchstones for the story. Whether it's the dice enhancement like you get with the Star Wars RPG, but also avoiding some of the pitfalls. I think you actually picked up on something that a lot of seasoned GMs don't learn until later on, which is sometimes you can get a stranglehold from the material, from the source material, whether it's because you have to delve through all these different spells and find out all these different rules, or you're in a tried and true property like Star Wars, where it's like, okay, the person across the way from me probably knows how to field strip a blaster from knowing the nerd logic and stuff. And yes, I'm one of those people, but we'll skip over that. But yeah, that can sometimes be a stranglehold on you. In that regard. So that's something that, did you run into that during the session 0 that you had?
In the sense of like kind of canon or stuff getting in the way, or not too bad. I mean, it was an interesting session. I've got a foul mouth Marxist Jawa with a very polite translator droid, and working with a Bothan and another droid. So like the dynamics a little weird, to see the Jawa out running rebel missions was, probably not. At first it was kind of like, how are we going to make that work? And then I just kind of stopped and I went, you tell me how it works. He's your character, and so one of the things I did in the session 0 was they started out, and the opening scene is they're being shuttled to the mission, and they're having a conversation with the pilot. Just for getting the timing of things, I had Wedge's shuttle in their pilot form. He's running them undercover because it takes place sort of right after the Death Star, and so Wedge is flying them out, and he's I had just a series of like you had mentioned in a post you had seen a post on the campfire style questions, So I had Wedges talking to him, say, hey, how'd you get into the rebellion? What is it? Why are you doing this? What do you bring to the table? And I just sort of tried to get him to narratively work that out in that session 0. And by doing that, they came up with plenty of good reasons that sort of, we go, oh, okay. Well, if it's not canon, at least it makes sense in our campaign.
Sure.
And then we're pretty good to go with that. So.
And that's you mentioned the campfire thing. It was a link that I think Geek and Sundry had shared, where an opportunity to delve into a character's past is to use that campfire question, like you're sitting around the fire or you're sitting around the starship, and how did you come to join the rebellion? How is a Jawa who has certain social beliefs and speaks in a certain dictum end up in the rebellion? Are you a mercenary? Are you whatever? Yeah. No, that's great stuff. I think the idea of being able to have that kind of a shared narrative at the table, and I use that phrase a lot. Folks out there who've listened to me before know I'm a big fan of that. It helps folks get invested in the game, especially when they know that the game master is really paying attention to the creative work they put into their character, especially the backstory. I mean, half the time back when I would run characters or play characters, I would have 5 pages of narrative that never hit the table, right? But it was always in my head. It was always in my head, and it's nice to have a game master that brings that out and kind of says, I want to honor your creativity, but at the same time, I want to see how I can spool that into the thread, right? You want to weave that into the story. So that's a lot of fun. That's a lot of fun. So with the developing this game, so you're using kind of the beginner box story from Age of
Yeah.
Rebellion?
Yeah, I took, since I had sort of muddled my way through it once or twice with
I had
friends
some
and a couple.
experience, we're kind of flying
Yeah,
through
so
it.
I knew this, it's takeover at Whisper Base is the scenario. And so it's this rebel, essentially assault of a base, which now in looking back, I'm like, it's essentially a Star Wars dungeon crawl.
Yeah.
Is what it is. It's just you go in, take over the base, and so it's interesting. But I was looking back, and I think one of the hiccups early on was, and why we didn't really do it well, is it doesn't really provide you with opportunities to actually have social interactions with your characters. Now, I think a seasoned set of role players might come at it and they might talk more and explore, but we were just like, move token there, move guy over there, we were just moving pieces on the map. And so one of the things I wanted to do was boost that narrative and that social interaction. And so what I essentially did was I had a few ideas of my own, but I also took what was actually supposed to be the follow-up to a lot of the stuff, like, oh, now you sort of got a bait, now you do these things. I took some of these extra things and I sort of took a few of those and said, well, what if I moved that to the front? What if they had to do these things? What if they have to go figure it out a little bit more? And essentially I wanted it to be, because I wanted that social interaction, I said, well, I'm going to strip it way back and say, the only thing I told them was, your mission is to take over the base. We're dropping you here. Here's the name of your contact.
Nice.
Go. And that's it. So they got to get in the city. They got to talk to people to find the person they got to talk to find the base, to do these things. And so I wanted that. And then, as the GM, I sort of have ideas for sort of various things that some seeds that I'll drop that they may or may not choose to sort of follow. And then I sort of had the idea, if they did this, they could get this benefit from these various things. But also knowing that, boy, they're in a big city, they might pull something that I have no idea. So they threw me for a loop a little bit when they requested speeder bike cores. I said, speeder bike cores? Okay. And then I was able to get them to, one of the other PCs was like, yeah, why don't you tell us why you want those? And boy, he had this great, I'm going to use it to do this, and that. And I'm like, awesome. I, would have never imagined that. And so that's a whole thing now. And, so, so it's good.
Lesson one, when you first approach a game, take your plans and then throw them away.
Just throw them away.
You have your thread and let's just see what they do. But that's great. You're kind of rolling with it, right? You're taking what they have. And,
I wanted to roll with it. And so, but that was good, and I liked that idea of they have a very specific end point or a funneling point, at least I would say. They have a mission, and that's, I'm enjoying this, the Age of Rebellion, squad sort of dynamics rather than the Edge of Empire, which is sort of like, you're just a bunch of mercenaries. You're just whatever you want to do. At least for me as a newer GM, being like, you've been ordered to go do this. Like, that's the first thing I tell them. And so that helps keep moving. So then they're all moving towards that point. And in that sense,
they may go all over the galaxy or
they may
places in the city, but that's, where they have to end up.
And they do too. So it's I don't have to railroad them. No. They're gonna get there. And so in that sense, what's nice is, rather than trying to build ways to railroad them, I'm trying to build branches out and build a myriad set of paths that they might take. And if they don't choose to take any of them, that's fine. They go do the base, and they find something else, and we roll with that. And so that's been nice on the sort of this idea of being a squad with a goal, and that group dynamic, which would be very different than dropping into a Dungeon World game where it's like, hey, what are we doing?
Sandbox. Yeah,
A sandbox. So, so I think that was a good choice for me as a new GM to sort of have that sort of a dynamic where I'm not forced to railroad them, but just the way that the type of game that we set up makes that happen, and I just get to kind of, it's a broad railroad, and we're bouncing in between, and occasionally going out and coming back, and
Well, I like what you're saying. You took the challenge that you had, right, of using this adventure, right, using this particular adventure, and you actually turned it into a strength. I think that's actually very cool. The idea of having that plot point where you need to go. They need to arrive at this point in order to be successful for this given mission, and the squad-based tactics of it, or the squad feel of it, you're all in a mission on a certain directive. So it made me think that actually a couple of different options for gaming for new players might be like a heist scenario. Similar vein, right? You're going into a dungeon, you have to find a certain point and get something and then come back out. So it could be kind of similar to a dungeon crawl, but it almost kind of engenders the players to think of options, right? Like I think the way you front loaded some of that information and said, okay, here's where you're going, here's your contact, here's the city I'm going to drop you off in, I'm out. But they have a direction, and they have a whole city to find information from. Okay, there could be libraries, there could be bars, there could be secret rebel cells, there could be Imperials they could snatch and punch them in the face and get information from them, and the Jawa can, proselytize his social views to them. So I think that's really key to like a first time GM, and maybe even to a table of first time players, is giving them a directive or a direction, and maybe a few directives, but getting them. There's two things that you're accomplishing here, and I'm lauding the praise upon you because you're doing a fantastic job. Is the idea of giving them a direction, but then giving them options. So you're getting two aspects of role playing games right then and there. How would my character deal with this situation? What resources would I leverage as a character? And then why does that matter? Why does that matter? Well, because I'm going to ask you how you got into this business. How'd you become a jewel thief? Or how did you become a star pilot? And it gets you thinking. It could be a one-word response, a one-line response, or it could be a paragraph. My father was a pilot, my grandfather was a pilot, and my great-grandmother was a pilot. So it's just all of that can just come out at the table organically. So,
I think there's a good dynamic of being able to leverage external authority, right? Yeah. So I have set up in narratively that this power structure exists. The Rebel Alliance says you do this, but that could be anything. It could be any kind of military or a guild or somebody with a superior structure of something that says you will do this, and so the PCs are okay, I'm doing this, and then what that does is it's not me as the GM saying, no, you have to go over here. You want to go there, but you gotta go. Because I feel like it's in a lot of games the GM has a scenario, but it's never been said that you must, or and so it's this. You're feeling like you're chopping off their decisions, or you're taking away their agency, or those sorts of things, and so just narratively setting that up. Look, a full sandbox is fun, but if you want a sandbox, you have to sandbox too, as a GM. And I said, I don't want to do that. I want to, I'm like, I want you to go over there because
this isn't like a 15 session of everybody looking at each other going, you want to, what do I want to invent?
What do we want to do? So doing that, it could be if you're playing 5th edition or something, that could just be, look, you guys are bounty hunters. You got a bounty on this guy, and you're gonna get the bounty. You're gonna do this, but then stepping back and saying, I don't care how you do it, but
here you are. You're in the city of Flan. You've got X amount of days to do it. I think time limits can help as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much as a railroad scenario, but it's a way that you can kind of check them to move them along. Because sometimes if you give them a lot of options and they think, well, I got a lot of room to play with this, but if you can introduce some measure of not so much railroading, but pushing, like, okay, well,
moving you
you're
forward.
now on midday and you started this first thing in the morning. Well, how does it take that long? Well, you went here, here, and here, and that takes time to walk. So it just kind of gives them a sense of urgency, which will motivate them to continue and push forward.
Yeah.
So that's cool. Well,
Yeah.
you know what? I think this is going to be kind of a cool thing that we're going to continue as you progress in this season of game mastering. You're going to be taking this Age of Rebellion session through to its end, to a weekly game that you're going to be doing, and so I think it would be a great time to check in each week and see how you're doing. Certain challenges you've run into, some things that you've learned. You're already kind of displaying the advanced tactics that game masters have been doing it for a while are already displaying. So kudos to you for having those innate skills and studying up. But yeah, everybody out there, this will be kind of an ongoing thing. We're going to work through this thing with Brian and see how he does with his first jaunt into game mastering. But I'd like to turn this into a regular thing where we start working on role-playing game dynamics and how it can help people, how it can improve your games, how you can put a game together on the fly. Who knows? So thanks a lot for joining us, Brian. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Fantastic job. We will talk to you all soon. This is Uncle Jeff and Brian saying have a good night and keep gaming.
Good night.